Hayden is highly capable, but if he just applied himself and put a bit more effort in and stopped stuffing around in class, he would get much better grades. This was pretty much the theme of every parent and teacher interview, every report card I got when I was going through that phase of my life. I used to think I was lazy. I used to think that I was a class clown, but what I learned later was I actually was just avoiding failure. I was avoiding effort. I was avoiding that risk of giving it a go in case it didn't work. And I mentally felt comfortable with this vision of like, I know I could do it if I just tried. And that would be my fallback, that I'd be like, one day I would do that. But what I actually learned was that unmotivated students like myself, we're perceived as lazy. The school system doesn't know how to deal with disengaged kids. But what I've learned is that students love what they think they're good at and they hate what they think they're bad at. And actually all begins back at confidence. And so when we talk about motivation in today's episode, we're going to dive into the second stage of the transformation marathon, beyond confidence. So the only way to get to engagement, to get to motivation, is to build up confidence. So if you're interested in learning more about confidence, go back to episode 3, and we have an entire session where we talk through the frameworks of confidence and how to actually bring that to life. Now we're going to go to the next step. Once we begin that journey, where does motivation come from? What does it look like? And how you can utilize this information with yourself or your child moving forward. But yeah, there's a definite misconception industry-wide. We work with over 100 schools around Australia over the last 15 years in helping them improve their students' grades. And a lot of the time, there's students that are just bucketed as lazy or disengaged, and they're misunderstood. A lot of the time I find I'm unraveling that, saying, well, no, they're actually not lazy. They're not disengaged. I can tell you that from firsthand. They just don't believe in themselves, and kids don't like to do things that they don't think that they're good at. So it's something that comes over time. We need to be patient with, and comes off the back of building confidence. And it's something that can be really hard to unravel when there's been attempt after attempt or negative event after negative event on a student, whether that be a report card, getting in trouble. Like myself, I was constantly in trouble trying to deal with my ADHD, and just developed this belief that I wasn't going to ever be good at something, that I wasn't smart, I wasn't intelligent. So therefore I disengaged and had no motivation. I avoided it. I did everything I could to avoid it. I was good at making other kids laugh in class, so that's what I invested all my time in, and I was very good at that. I was the ultimate distractor. And we have so many students that are like that at the moment. I remember moving into year 8 in particular and dropping from C's to E's in maths. And I didn't sit back and go, oh, I'm going to do better next term. I started going, math isn't for me. I hate maths. Math sucks. I don't see why I need to do this. And I spent more time trying to distract my friends and make them laugh, because I was pretty good at doing that. It wasn't until I got to year 9 that I had a different teacher, a funny guy called Mr. Kappa, a German guy. And he was so passionate and in love with math that it was hard not to get enthusiastic about that. My environment changed. I was spending time around a different environment in that class, coming from a teacher that didn't want to be there, that really was just kind of doing the minimum to get by. And he sparked that initial love for math, and then would combine it with, hey, I know you can do it. I know you can do it. And then that confidence came, and then he created that environment that made you want to love math. And then math became the first subject that I ended up getting an A on and popping through. I loved it because it was black and white. Like, there was no bias on what the teacher thought. It was you were right or you were wrong. And there was a direct correlation with the work I put in and the result I would get. And that's how I learned about motivation, and how motivation is something that compounds and grows over time, just like confidence. But you can't develop motivation, you can't build engagement without confidence first. You need to have that shift in the headspace. And the better that the confidence builds, the more that the student starts thinking, hey, I'm pretty good at this, the more they start liking it, and then eventually it becomes their favorite subject, and then they become exceptional at it. And so understanding that, we need to look at the lens that we're looking at this through, because a lot of these students, we call them drifters when they come to us. They have low confidence, low motivation, and they're disengaged. They're just drifting through school, drifting through life. And they're the students that get the greatest transformations the fastest, because you can build the momentum of confidence within 2 or 3 sessions, and then motivation within the 3rd, 4th, 5th session. And then that's the rocket fuel, and you're up and moving from that point. And this comes back to the science of the Pygmalion effect as well, that we were talking about earlier, which is that the belief that somebody has in you shapes the belief that you have about that, which shapes the fuel and the action you take, which then gets the result, and then that gets faster and faster and faster as we run through that. The key here is really surrounding your child around the right environment. You want to have them around the right team, the right environment. I remember when I went through my own transformation, I went from sitting up the back corner of the class, and all my friends at that point in year 9 were kids that were also getting D's for effort and conduct, and it was cool not to try. And one of the first things that I decided to do was to move up the front and move away from them. And all of a sudden I was sitting with a new group of people who thought that getting better grades was cool, and that was just part of what they were. And they were on a mission to dux the class. And I remember thinking it was no different to sport. Like, we had that culture in swimming where it was about, we want to win the national title, as opposed to, we're too cool to be here. And this was the first time I'd witnessed that in school, where these other students were going head to head on who could, win that trophy at the end of the year. And now, years later, looking back, they're all surgeons and doctors and some of the most successful people in the world, and all began back at that point. What I found in that move, though, it wasn't just about moving away from students who weren't aligned with where I want to go, but there's a science that I learned years later called the mirror-neuron effect. And so essentially it's a psychological science that says that we have neurons in the front of our prefrontal cortex of our brain, and they mirror the behaviors and patterns and attitude and energy of everybody around us. And so they're an inbuilt social mechanism that we have as humans to allow us to get along as a community and, I guess, have a high probability of survival throughout time. Now, when you take that concept, this is why when you spend a lot of time around somebody, you start picking up the same slang as them, the same language as them, you start looking more and more like them, and it all happens without you ever noticing. It's also why if you're sitting there and you're all of a sudden watching someone drink water, you start thinking, oh yeah, I'm pretty thirsty, I could drink water. If you're watching them eat something, you start getting hungry. That's the mirror-neuron effect firing, and it goes all day, every day, with everybody, everywhere. And so that statement of you are who you hang out with, or you are the average of your 5 best friends, comes directly from that underpinning science that the more you spend with a certain type of energy in person, the more you start becoming like that. And I went through that myself, going from a certain group of friends into this new group where initially it felt uncomfortable, but it wasn't long before I was starting to speak their language. I also was starting to have that same energy and that same focus, and I completely shifted who I was by changing environments. I was fortunate enough to also experience that at an elite high performance level when I was in the higher ranks of swimming. When in 2011 and 12, I'd moved to a swim squad in Southport where we had 13 Olympians and a world record holder in the squad. And it was the first time I'd ever experienced what it was like to be around every single person wanting to be the best and wanting to achieve things that never been done. And that standard that the entire team held each other accountable for, and the way that they thought and the way that they did things, they were never late, they were always on time, sessions were never missed. It was this high performance group. It changed my character into that space and took me to a level that I never would have been at without that. And so when unpacking motivation, I think that's one of the biggest key pieces here, is when confidence builds, it creates that momentum effect, but a lot of it is surrounding yourself around the right environment. And I truly think that move from that group of friends up the front to this new group of friends was the shift that changed my headspace, my environment, that changed everything about how I worked and how I functioned. And it wasn't long before I found myself in year 11 and 12 being obsessed with, how do I beat them? How do I become the best in the class? I want to win this game. And so I would spend every little pocket I had doing every extra little bit of work, and I would mark every hour that I would do, and I would try to fill out the most books full of notes and do the most questions. And that became something to claim, and my headspace went, how far can I push the limit if I do the most extreme amount of work? And I always wanted to come to an exam or come to a race and feel like nobody had done more work than me. Now, we talk about the extreme higher end. You go back 2 years, and I was that kid that did the least amount of work, that paid attention for 10% of the class, that never handed homework in. And it's the same kid. It shows that I wasn't lazy. It wasn't who I was. It was the environment I was around and the transformation of my confidence. Where I found the biggest peak for that was in swimming, fascinatingly enough. When I was 14, I won a bunch of silver medals at nationals. Then I went into 15 and I was ranked number 1 in the country in the 200 butterfly. And then my training partner decided to do that event just for a joke, and then he won. And he also won 9 other gold medals. He was dubbed the next Ian Thorpe. He was a phenomenal swimmer. He ended up going on to the Olympics years later. But at that point, I remember getting second again and going, I don't want to be second. I want to see what I can do to win. And the next season, my confidence had started improving. I had 2 years of getting second. My motivation was improving. I remember sitting down at the start of the 2008 season, and I wanted to do the most amount of work that any athlete had ever done. And so I designed a program that was 11 swim sessions a week when we were required to do 10, 5 gym sessions, and then I would do 3 runs and like a circuit Ironman session and 2 power sessions. And so it became something like 20 sessions, and I knew that everybody else was doing 10, 11 sessions, and I was doing 20. And it was one of the most hardest periods of my life because all I did was like train, sleep, train, sleep, train, sleep. And I went from a 53-second 100 freestyle to a 50.3 that year. And that's when I went from second Australia to the fastest 16-year-old on the planet. And it came from that extreme where I knew if I wanted to be extraordinary, I needed to do something that other people weren't doing. And it's fascinating to look at that because, like I said, you go forward 4 years before that, and I was that kid that tried everything I could to cut laps, to miss sessions because I was sick and I had a sore shoulder. And, and why I say that is that motivation isn't something that you're born with. It's not something that, it's not because that somebody's lazy. A lot of the time, it's because that spark of believing that you're good at something doesn't exist yet. And so the finesse and the art of it is, how do we get a student or an athlete or anybody over time to have these little wins that builds their confidence, and then the confidence starts making them think, oh, hey, I'm actually not too bad at this. And then they try that little bit more, do that extra bit of work, and that motivation flywheel begins and gets faster and faster. And then you can push that into like the upper echelons of how far that can go. I also had a fascinating student that I worked with, where there's this particular student we worked with, and we'll do a limitless file session on her, no doubt. And she was in year 11. And what was wild was her parents had passed away when she was a young age from a drug overdose. And so she had lived with her grandmother. And this student was a C student, was confident, knew that she could do it, but just didn't have that engagement, was disengaged. And we began on the process, and we would put down 1 goal that week that needed to be achieved. And then the next week was 2. And then when that got achieved, we went to 3, and then 4, then 5. And we got to a certain point where we'd essentially mimicked the 75 hard challenge. If you haven't heard of that, have a look at Andy Frizella's MFCEO podcast, the 75 hard challenge. I took that concept and said, what if we applied that to academics with a student? And this actually happened. And so every single day, this student had to go for an outdoors walk, drink 2 liters of water, read 10 pages of a book, do an hour of study, and do 10 practice questions. And I held her accountable every single day. And I would make her come and meet me at Burleigh on the Gold Coast at 3:30 in the morning, and she'd be like, why are we doing this? And I'm like, I'm going to teach you what the extreme can look like, and we're just going to do it, and we're going to see where it ends up. And we did this for 12 weeks, and she got better and better and better. And then by the end, I noticed that she went from like, do we have to do this, to then challenging me and going, what else can we do? How can we push this? And this student within 6 months went from C's to A's and absolutely dominated. But it was fascinating watching a disengaged student that thought that they were too cool to do work all of a sudden become, how much can I do? How much further can I go? And it just came from those little wins, the confidence building. And what I say is like the transformation of her own love of what she does. Like, she became good at it. She became better at it. Classes became better. Studying became better. She got better exam results, better test results. And all of a sudden, it was her favorite subject. And she was doing all that extra work to get to that point. And the main point I'm trying to make here is not that every single student should do that and go to those extremes. But if you peel it all back, motivation isn't something a student's born with. It doesn't define a lazy characteristic. It almost always comes from the student not liking what they don't think they're good at. So if you can get them good at it, they will like it. And then over time, they will like it more and more and more. And how far that goes, you know, I think comes down to them and what they want to achieve and where their glass ceiling is. And that was a story that I wanted to share, both from my swimming point of view and with this student, to really come home and hit that point. And we work with a lot of schools where we take a cohort, particularly in the boarding school space, where the students live at the school, they're there all the time. And I always wondered why you see the stats and boarding school students perform worse than day students. And it was like mind-blowing for me. It's like But boarding schools are almost like mini performance centers. They could be. I spent some time at the AIS when I was younger, and from the moment you walk on campus there, every single thing is geared to high performance, from the people that are there, the dorms that are there, the recovery centers, the coaches, like everything is about high performance, and you're permanently surrounded by this environment of inspiration and performance, and every athlete that goes there lifts and achieves things. I watched one of my good mates, James Roberts, move there and go from, second, third in Australia to the fourth fastest 100 freestyler ever in history in 2012. And it was fascinating watching his journey going to the AAS after being there myself when I was younger. But looking at the boarding space, we've always gone, why can't that be? And that's one of the things we go plug into the boarding school and we look at everything that's going on, and we put a 3-year stage program in where year 1 is about building confidence and shaping the culture and changing the way that the students think. So it has nothing to do with their grades and how well they understand a topic and how lazy they are, for instance. It's just, we're going to build a culture of confidence. And then in year 2, we transition into motivation, and then we give them the blueprints and we challenge them. We say, how much can you do? And all of a sudden you start seeing student by student, because every student's on their own journey, start to engage. And as we get to a certain tipping point where 51% of the students are motivated, and then that's when it goes bang, and all of a sudden within a term 60%, then 70%, then 80%, and it rapidly moves because the majority moves that way. The environment changes, the mirror neurons are firing, and all of a sudden you're shaping this high performance culture. Then into the 3rd year, we actually do nothing, but the grades go nuts. They spike, and then the school sits back and goes, I can't believe our boarders are getting better grades, and day students has never happened in history. And it all begins with confidence, building the culture and motivational environment, and then just letting that rip and seeing how far that can go. And so that's a fascinating thing that I didn't know was possible in the early years. We've been working with schools for 10 years now, so it took a long time to be able to figure this out and track that. But it just shows that motivation isn't something you're born with. It doesn't mean the student's lazy. You need to look at it through the lens of, they don't think they're good at this. How can I get them to think that they're good at this? And that's the beginning of that process. So they're the main lessons that I've learned through this process that I want you guys to learn is build that confidence using the Pygmalion effect, and then shape the environment and using the mirror neuron science to bring that motivation to life. And it's the fuel that drives the entire engine. And it's funny when you talk through this, because when I first began down this process, I thought that student transformation would come purely from just doing more questions, doing more work. But 80% of the finesse and the art of it is the psychological mindset shifts around confidence and motivation. And when you unlock those, you move into the next stages of learning, being metacognitive. So how you think about how you think. So that's study strategies, how you learn, all those things. And then the actual cognitive learning process. Now, all of that is 20% of the picture. 80% is the confidence and motivation. And when that gets right, it's the fuel that drives everything else. So when you're sitting there going, what do I do? My kid hates school. They don't want to do anything. Peel back those layers and go, let's begin with confidence. And then once that confidence starts building, let's shape the environment around them. Don't even think about doing more work or doing more study until we get to that point. So they're the main lessons from today, guys. Thanks so much for coming to this session, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session where we'll continue to build your A game.